Okay, now for the remainder of the talk, what I'd like to do is just talk briefly about some kinds of, strategies that you can use to help you get through these difficult times. The first thing that we're facing as a challenge, and a thing where we can really perhaps, take some small steps to help ourselves, is in the area of enhancing self-regulation. What does that mean? It means doing some things to help us develop resiliency, which you see by the tree on the left, the ability to to bend but not break in these situations, to kind of go with the flow a little bit, to keep ourselves in emotional balance, and on the right, to take care of ourselves, to engage in self-care and to nurture ourselves. And there basically are two paths to enhancing self-regulation. One is changing what we do, and the second is changing how we think. Now, let's start with changing what we do. And I want to focus in particular on self-care. Self-care is something that has really been shown to have beneficial effects in times of stress. And whether, so that might be doing sport, it might be just going for a walk in nature, it might be buying a plant at home, or planting a garden. It could be just remembering to breathe. It could be if you practice some meditation or learning how to do meditation or yoga. These are all activities, task-oriented, active forms of coping that have been shown to have benefits during times of stress. Now, I have to confess, I'm not a person who's really very good at doing these kinds of things. Some people have a lot more self-discipline than I do. So what I've learned to do over time is develop some strategies that work for somebody like me, somebody who's not that self-disciplined. And the first thing I would say is just start small. Sometimes your big ambitions can get in the way of making small changes, but small changes can make a big difference, right? So just like we were scale back your expectations now. See if you can start by thinking of even one small thing that you might do differently in the area of self-care. And now second, when you initiate that activity, do it with mindful awareness. What that means is really notice and be in touch with whatever your experience is of doing this activity, and just pay attention to it without judging it. How do you feel when you do the activity? How do you feel after the activity? How is this different from how you normally feel? Now, why is that important? Because our brains and our bodies are giving us feedback, automatic feedback about what's working for us. If you feel good after doing these activities and you allow yourself to take that in and to just enjoy it for a little bit, that's reinforcing, that's positive reinforcement. And that's going to increase the chance that we're engaging in more of these behaviors. And every time you even take a small step, even if you just take a moment and think about, is there something small I might do differently? Or doing something differently, or bringing mindful awareness to your experience, give yourself a V for victory. Okay, that's a victory. It's a small victory. We're talking about everyday small victories here, like drops in a bucket that are filling up a bucket. So give yourself that credit, because that's also a way of reinforcing yourself. Now, that has to do with self-regulation in terms of, what are some of the ways in which you can do things to enhance your self-regulation. Another way in which we can regulate ourselves has to do with how we look at situations, how we think about situations. In other words, it's sort of like having a kind of relationship with stress. Most of us, when it comes to stress, we just want to push it away or ignore it or escape from it. But this suggests having a kind of relationship with stress. And research has shown that how you interpret stress, how you appraise stress, that's just a fancy word for interpreting, affects how you feel. And so, for example, let's say you're dealing with one of the threats that we're facing right now, like the biological threat. And you think to yourself, there is a high chance that this virus is going to kill me. If that's how you're thinking, then undoubtedly you're going to experience higher stress, right? That makes sense. It's a kind of catastrophic way of thinking. It's like, my chances are very high that something terrible is going to happen to me, or let's say to somebody that I love. And naturally, that's going to increase your stress levels. Now compare that to this. This is a reappraisal, meaning coming up with a different interpretation of the situation. The chances that I will die if I get the virus are actually very low, probably less than 1%. Now, what's very interesting is that the latest data that's coming out suggests that the actual mortality rates from the virus for those who get it are less than 1%. On average, it may be about 0.5%. And for some people who are in the lowest age group, like lowest age groups, and who don't have any, health complications, probably even less than that. So notice then that if you reappraise the threat, you're going to end up feeling differently. It's going to lower your stress level. Now, not only in these situations do we appraise threat, but we also appraise our attempts to cope. We kind of ask ourselves, we pay attention to how we're coping. We say, how am I doing? How am I doing? Well, this is called coping appraisal. How do you interpret your own acts of coping? And sometimes you may say to yourself, I can't handle this situation for one more day. Well, clearly, if you feel that way, if you think that way, it's going to affect your feelings. You're going to have high stress. But if you reappraise the situation, if you change how you think about it, you might say something like, I'm going to take this one day at a time. I'm going to live more in the moment and worry less about the future. And if you can think in that way, it lowers your stress. Okay, so this shows that in terms of changing our emotional regulation, there are basically two paths. One is by doing, and one is sort of changing the way that we're appraising or interpreting the situation. Now, why do some of us, tend to have such an overestimate of what the actual threat is to us? Why do some of us think, if I get the virus, I'm going to have a 50% chance of dying, or whatever it would be? Part of it is that, the media is full of information now about the virus and about the situation, right? So, I'm a kind of a news junkie. If you go to any news website, that's all there is now. It's all Corona news. It's not fun. It's not the old fun news we used to have. It's all Corona news. And naturally, because that's all the information that's out there, we tend to misinterpret the danger that's involved in the situation. And yes, there is a danger on the large scale. If we don't do anything about the virus, of course, many, many people will develop it, and then large numbers could die if it gets spread on a massive scale. But actually, the individual threat to you is probably very, very small. Now, another way that we can reappraise stress is by finding meaning in it. And maybe some of you are familiar with this book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, which came out, 60 years ago. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor. He was an Austrian neurologist, and he actually was doing some psychotherapy in the concentration camps, right? So he was Jewish, he was interned, and he survived. And what he said, if you read his book, is that the people who were able to find some kind of meaning in this dreadful situation, they were the ones who had a greater chance of surviving. So it's kind of a reframing. We call that a reframing in cognitive psychology, changing the way you think about a stressful situation as a kind of adversity challenge. And here are a couple of things that Viktor Frankl said. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Okay, that's very powerful. To me, what this means is that the ultimate freedom that we have is internal. No matter what the situation, the external situation is, we always have internal freedom to change ourselves and how we feel about it and how we deal with it. And he also said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Meaning that when we react to things, we often do it without thinking. We often don't stop and just take a moment of mindful awareness and realize, I have a choice right now about how I'm going to feel, about how I'm going to react, about how I'm going to cope. And that space is freedom. Now, this concept of Frankl's about our internal freedom relates to another important concept in terms of stress and coping, and that's the difference between external and internal locus of control. Some people are more externally oriented in their locus of control. And the question here is, who has the control over my destiny? If you feel kind of automatically that other people have the control of your destiny, you're likely to experience more stress. So for example, if you feel that your behavior is more guided by things like fate or luck or by other people or by external circumstances, then you're going to experience likely more stress. That's what the research literature shows. But if your locus of control is internal, then you make a statement like, I control my own destiny. And that means that my behavior is guided by my own personal decisions and my own personal efforts. Now, some people tend to be more externally oriented, some people tend to be more internally oriented. But what this suggests is, and I think it couples very nicely with Viktor Frankl's work, that you could potentially shift your locus of control toward more internal by searching for your inner freedom, right? That if we can try to live more by what Viktor Frankl said, then essentially what that means is, it doesn't mean that the external situation doesn't matter, right? Of course it matters, but it helps us to move our locus of control more internal and therefore have more power and more control over how we feel.